anything that you guys would like to talk about since this is the group study. Do you have a question or is there anything on your mind that you'd like to kick off with? Donna, usually have something to talk about. What should we talk about today?
I usually have something to talk about, don't I?
Usually.
I just am noticing today that I did not start my practice when I woke up with any intention. I did not spend any deliberate time in any way, whether it was picking tricks of attention or even tuning into my body. Did not do that at all this morning. And it's been a habit of mine to do. I went right into the list of things that I have to do. It's getting close to crunch time to getting all my crap out of the house. And it's just, there's not enough time in the day as I look around to get that done. And that sentence in and of itself shows that I have not done anything this morning other than go right into thought streams. And I can feel immediately, I haven't even been awake that long, that I haven't accumulated that much tension or shallow breathing or tenseness in my body. Right at this moment, as I tune into my senses, I can notice a degree of discomfort that is fairly extreme for only being up and out of bed, didn't even have my coffee yet, a very short time. And that's because I didn't engage anything. I didn't engage anything. And boy, were all of those thought streams right there spinning quickly and producing an undesired effect. That's just the narration of what happened to me this morning. So I don't necessarily want to talk about it, but I definitely observe it. So as I continue now, I'm thinking about my golden line. I'm standing about my throat, about where my shoulders are in proximity to my ears, and getting back to the practice.
Yeah, it's a good thing we had group study, huh? Because then get you right back where we need to be. The only thing I would mention, because you didn't, I mean, I appreciate you sharing. So, I mean, I guess that's what group study is really all about. That's what it's for, is to come with the practice that we have or don't have, and then, this in itself can be an object of redirection. So, just coming to this group study, I've always viewed that as a part of a formal practice. But the only thing I would mention, since you didn't really ask any questions, is focusing on the shoulders to the ears. Focusing on the shoulders causes an enormous amount of pain in the shoulders and neck. So the only recommendation I would make, unsolicited, is heavy elbows. Imagining the elbows being like energy centers, and really just noticing where they are and then putting them where they're more naturally comfortable, which is a little bit behind the body and usually a little bit behind the body. Of course, this changes depending on the orientation of your body as you go throughout the day. Like when you're walking, your arms are swinging, your elbows don't just stay behind you. Your arms are helping to uh, well, they're pumping blood in your body like your legs are when they're going back and forth like that. It's all a mechanism of getting the blood and the body flowing in a synchronistic way. But yeah, so that would be my only recommendation, is to not put too much focus in the shoulders, but rather think heavy elbows, heavy wrists. Where is, where are those right now? And then where would they more comfortably, naturally want to be? The more that we think, everything does start to rise, but notice that it feels almost like the elbows are pushing the shoulder up. And then in certain sitting postures at work desks and things like that, it's the same thing. If it's not the perfect height, then your elbow comes up, maybe when you're typing or when you're writing, or it comes out, and the shoulder will follow suit. So where the elbow goes, that shoulder will surely follow suit. Good morning, Lisa. All right, so yeah, we don't really have to talk about that. I think of course, it obviously it highlights the importance of engaging your practice right away, especially when you, I'm assuming that it felt almost like Donna's internal dialogue about what she needs to do today. It probably felt like it started before she even woke up, would be my guess. Is that's how it felt.
Yeah, it sure felt like it. And I was just remarking about, um, because I got your text on the group that said room is open, and I was like, oh shit, what time is it? Um, and and then I noticed my physical body. It was just, I noted, boy, I've been practicing a really long time, and I feel like I've made I've gained a lot of momentum in that practice. And to the extent that I can cheat and coast and then go, wait a minute, I'm coasting, and I can feel when the lag of the coasting starts to fall away, and it's because I'm not practicing. And I really notice a lot of subtle things. And when I am practicing, I really feel the expansion and something new and different almost every day. But today, because I didn't, and yes, I woke up probably with with it from yesterday, um, how quickly my thought streams became rabbit holes of, how quickly I was filled with just thought streams and had no attention on my body. And then when I started to notice my body standing here, it was a knotted ball of string already in such a short amount of time. That's what was there when I didn't do anything deliberate. That's what I noticed. I mean, I have a good toolbox for the practice to get back to it, but holy cow,
Hmm.
I can get far off track real fast.
Oh yeah, that's why we call this a group study, because everybody is subject to that same principle. So I have a lot of things going on in my life. There's this, that, or the other thing. It seems like that's always going to be the case. Very rarely is there just like nothing. There's things going on in the world. There's things going on in our smaller environments, our families, our friend groups. There's always something, and we'll need to move with that. That's always what we're implying, is adaptation is really moving with that, and almost like in a dance with everything. So, what Donna is noticing, I'll catch folks up, but, and thanks for hanging out. But she is mentioning that she didn't wake up with any practice. And so there's a lot of stimuli in her experience right now, because selling the house, there's a checklist of things to do. But, you look at it, that's always the case, isn't it? So there's this thing that I can't remember where we saw it, Shayna. It was like some sort of video, but it showed a model for happiness, but the model goes well beyond happiness. But basically, you can just imagine, if I had my whiteboard, now would be the perfect time to use it, huh? But I'll figure that out. But just imagine a staircase, and it's a very 90-degree angle staircase, and the vertical part of the staircase is basically you doing something to attain a goal. And then once you reach that goal, you're on the horizontal part, and then you're back to the vertical, because now you got a new goal. And then you get to the horizontal part, now you got a new goal. What was the first thing that I found flawed about that? Because, well, not flawed, but I just found a different way of looking at it, is the time that they spent on that plateau, the horizontal part, was way too elongated. It was way too long. The common mind, the average mind, doesn't spend that much time, just living in that accomplishment. Or, and then, like I said, this dynamic extends way beyond just accomplishments and like work goals and happiness. It actually starts to become a pattern. The way that the mind moves and interacts with most things, it starts to take on this pattern. But what I noticed is that the plateaus were way too elongated. They should be much shorter, because the average mind doesn't really, dig into the accomplishment before it's on to the, sometimes it'll be on to the next thing even before it had the opportunity to enjoy the most recent, in air quotes, accomplishment. And so that's the first thing that I noticed. And then, of course, the vertical lines weren't long enough. They're typically much longer because the amount of energy and the amount of focus and the amount of time that it takes for these things. And so that's how Donna's day sounds like it started. We have this list of things that we need to do. And then there's Donna perfectly right on time. That's exactly what happened. So I'm taking it from happiness, which is the way that the psychology, I don't know, it was like a video about a guy and the guy was talking about a thing. And so now I'm talking about that thing too. That's where it came from. But this idea of happiness being that model, but it goes well beyond just happiness because Donna was experiencing that in a very micro fashion with her day. It's on to the next thing and it's on to the next thought and it's on to this and it's on to that. And so what this video points out is that what we want to do is create this baseline. And that as long as we always have this baseline, there's always the opportunity for balance and not feeling overwhelmed. So we can get overwhelmed with either side of the spectrum. We can get overwhelmed with anger, frustration, the type of regret and sadness about the past that just gets, very heavy. But we can also get on that excited end of the spectrum where things are moving way too quickly and we don't have that center of balance. That's what's the word? I just saw the word in a business class and somebody was saying the word synergy. I think it was the word synergy, right? When you have the two opposites and you put them together and they create that new third thing. Yeah. But I saw that word used in business and I'm like, oh, I love that word. That is a perfect, that's a perfect example of what I do with my mind, taking two opposites, holding them both in my attention to create a new third thing that is neither this or that, but is both of those things at the same time. Yeah. So, I think we could use this as an opportunity. And I'll talk about my practice, and there's no reason to hold that, to anybody else's. We can all have our ways of doing things. The thing is are we putting power into it? And power, the way that I use the word, and you'll really get this through my book, the way that I use the word power means deliberate attention. If your point of attention is to have power, it has deliberate attention. If you as a human being are to have power, and it's not like power over things, it's not that kind of aggressive usage of the word. It just means you just start to step into that flow of energy and you start to take on that energy as well. You start to move with that velocity of the universe itself, which is a really fun thing to do. It's flow. That's the optimal human state. We're moving quicker than even thought can move in a manner of speaking. Yeah, so I don't want to, there's no reason to go into thoughts about comparing practices, but of course, it's really important to create that baseline. If we have that baseline of happiness, then the goals may still be there, but it's not the same model because we still are doing other things to create this baseline of in the example it was happiness, but in Donna's example it's our practice. We want to create a baseline of our practice to take it with us throughout the day to kind of alter this model that is just very goal oriented and very habit oriented and unconscious. So one of the ways that I do that personally is I have formal practices in addition to the informal practices. I think it is important at a certain point to really look and say, am I able to put these two things together? And we can look at opposite sides of the spectrum where all we're doing is focusing on the formal practices. And remember, formal practice would be like Donna wakes up and she goes into some 18 gates. I'm using the things that I do, maybe someone else, you go in and one of your morning, and I use the word ritual because it's not a habit. We're not going to create a habit out of it because we're charging it with awareness and focus and attention. but it could be to light some candles in the morning to get a certain ambiance going, or to go through a certain ritual of appreciating the day, however you want to get that thing going. And yeah, so now Donna says she's doing that now. Maybe substitute dialogue, listening to something, which the group study is obviously an opportunity for that, to kind of listen to things that can get the mind going in a direction that is more empowered. That's where the word power comes from, by the way. It's empowered. But the empowered mind going in a direction that is more beneficial. And you can still get all the things done. That's the fun aspect of that is you can still get everything that you need to get done. It's not like we need to, go into some formal meditative posture and, you know, not get the things that we need to get done because now we're at odds. It's like, well, how do I interact with the island of the practical while also interacting with my spiritual mindfulness and deliberate attention? Well, the key is informal, of course, but mixing that with a little bit of formal isn't a bad idea in ways that feel good to you. Whether it's, you could do certain types of movement. That's why I think Qigong movements are really nice. Breath with movement is really nice anytime you do that. Of course, things like yoga. Some people, like I was talking to Shayna today, some people will find relief in running. I would find displeasure in running, so I don't run. It's not really a thing I do. I don't want to do that, but somebody else may really enjoy that. So our practices will look different to a certain extent no matter what. For Gene, running can be an opportunity to deliberately engage the moment in a way that he sees fit. For me, running is an opportunity to redirect thought about not wanting to run. Do you see the difference? That's a different practice occurring. So yeah, finding ways to engage the morning. I mean, and it doesn't have to be the morning. It just depends when you wake up or what's going on throughout the day. But finding a way to check in as soon as you wake up is a critical component, I think, of this practice. And I think that's what's great about the group study is I never would have led with that today. So sometimes I miss these things just because I've been doing it, for so long. But that's a perfect opportunity to point out things like the deepest love, longest reach, highest vision. There's a reason that I go into that mantra every single day. Well, one reason is also to help keep focus because I noticed that I could never answer my teacher's question of what do you want? And I find that if I can create this baseline of what I want, everything else that I want, or if I get it, fine. If I don't get it, that's okay too, because I still have this very strong baseline occurring. So that's what is really charging everything else and holding up everything else. Does that make sense? Anybody want to share, what are some ways that you engage your practice first thing in the morning? You already know the deepest love, longest reach, highest vision. That helps me keep some focus. It helps me go straight into feeling into the isness of my life rather than what Donna was doing. And we talked about this the other day, but the mind focuses in on something small, like a task that she has to do, this invisible task that's in her mind that she thinks is like super duper important. And the mind focuses on that. And then before you know it, everything around you is about that because you've just blown it up out of proportion. And now everything is just oozing or it has a residual of that act. Well, that same principle applies with the practice. If you take that exact same principle and you engage your practice first thing in the morning, everything you do can have the same opportunity to have a little bit of practice essence. You may forget. In fact, depending on where we are in the practice, you will forget. That's the way this practice works. I still forget certain points of attention, though I'll lose them. and I maintain certain points as well. But I still lose certain points of attention. Imagination, superimposed imagination, is almost always the first to go with me, and breath attention with that tend to just fizzle away when someone cuts me off in traffic. I don't drive, but that's just an example, you know. But yeah, I also remembered that on Tuesday I didn't share the trick of attention that I do. I talked about that aperture of how when you look at things, you really focus in on them, they blow up in your experience. They just become so thick and important and heavy. You know, that's what the encumbering mind does, is it focuses on little things and makes them freaking enormous and heavy and dense. And this practice creates space in all of that. And so the natural feeling at first is relief, and then from relief to just this natural lightness and flow. Well, one of the tricks of attention that I start off with in the morning, I do this one throughout the entire day. So I'll share the trick of attention, and it has like a philosophical, like theoretical part to the trick of attention, but it also has a trick of attention, what you're doing with your attention. So it has both aspects. So the philosophical part we talked about on Tuesday, because when you focus on something, it blows up. When you use defocused vision, it feels like everything kind of evens out a little bit. You know, it feels when you're using the defocused vision, or you're using a peripheral vision, or you're using the bubble of perception, where you can even, this is a part of the technique too, is to imagine a bubble. Gene is in a room. That's a bubble of awareness. It will feel very likely to you. I don't want to float your boat. It'll feel likely very spherical. When you expand your awareness, it starts to feel spherical. That's how it feels, and that kind of makes sense to me. That, you know, something from an original point would feel spherical as it goes outward. It makes sense to me. But Gene's in a room right now, and he can imagine himself. At first, it starts with imagination, because that is a surefire door and entry point to spirit. The ancients had been doing it since the dawn of time. We can use our imagination as a gateway or a portal to feeling something that is tangibly there and accessible for all of us. So through imagination to spirit, that's not the only way. You know, there's a fiery way to do that as well, but imagination is a whole lot more fun. So what I'm recommending to Gene is using his mind and, to a certain extent, his imagination to create a bubble of perception that he can take with him throughout the day. Whether he is sitting, and you can add this, I'm doing it to the four modes, I'm adding it to whether he's sitting, standing, walking, or laying down, from either the center of the Dantian or whichever point in his body he chooses, that can become the center of the known universe. And then spherically, that can expand into the room that you're in, the environment that you're in, and wherever you put your attention, you are populating. Look at it as a form of data population. You are populating your bubble of perception with points of attention. Why? Because your mind isn't used to doing it habitually. You're adding power to the act of paying attention to the present moment. You're adding power to the moment, essentially. Well, you can cut out the other words. You're adding power to the moment. Does that make sense? That's a thing that we can do with our minds. It involves a little of imagination. And I'll add two more layers to this, just depending on where you're at in your practice. You can play with the different layers. Don't touch the other layers if you don't want to. But there are some other layers, and it still goes back to that philosophy of the way that we focus on things. Now, Donna was focusing on tasks. That is a thought in her mind. She's made that up. Now, that still probably means that there's something to do that's not as made up. Gene could observe that. You need to do this before you sell your house. I can see that. We can agree on that. We could call that a shared truth. Or you can just call it truth. That's what truth implies, that it's a shared thing. But okay, so Donna started to focus on these thoughts about these things. Now, it's the thoughts about the things that are completely unnecessary. Can we all agree that, at least in theory or hypothesis, let's step back. In hypothesis, Donna could have woken up and not had a single thought around the things that she needs to do. Jean and I would still agree that she needs to do the things, or at least they need to be done. In some way, there's these tasks that, at least right now, we think that they need to be done before she could move. We always have something to do, it seems, right? Okay. Can we also say, hypothetically, she could do those things without thinking about them? And those things could get done without all the thought, hypothetically. She could think about, oh, who knows? I mean, she could think about rainbows and unicorns and, you know, I have no idea. I'm sorry. Rainbows and unicorns doesn't strike me as what Donna's going to be thinking about, but she could. I mean, it is in that field of options and possibility. Yeah, no. But regardless, it could be deliberate thought, deliberate points of attention. Okay, so focusing on an individual thing. Well, we also have peripheral, where we expand our vision, we expand our attention, and now we have more like you could look at it like the fizzling on a TV when it's in between channels, static. It's kind of spread out. Your attention is kind of spread out evenly a little bit. A little bit of attention behind you, a little bit of attention in front of you, and that is doing something with your attention that you're likely not used to doing. Your mind, most minds are not used to kind of stepping back. Now, we do it sometimes. When you step out in nature, you're like, trees, birds, nature, you're stepping back. You're kind of immersing yourself into it. Maybe a happy moment. Maybe you wake up in the morning and you see a family member or a friend or someone you love and you're having a happy moment, and you're naturally stepping into that, unless you're in severe psychological suffering, and then you can miss all of that. But this group very likely isn't in, Donna gave an example of not engaging her practice. I don't think she gave an example of severe psychological suffering, not yet. If that had accumulated for a couple days or a couple weeks, we would probably be doing a one-on-one at some point about what the hell. All right, so we have this expanded way of looking at a situation that can actually become a trick of attention. So this is kind of different, because I'm not using the world. I'm using almost like an imaginary scenario, but not quite. But what I'm imagining is my body from like that third person point of view, to where I can see more, I can feel more of my experience, the bubble of perception, where I'm populating the bubble of perception, so the attention starts to kind of expand, as opposed to just focus. Does that make sense? That's the second layer. We have two layers. One we're usually doing unconsciously. We can add that back later, which is the focus on the one thing. We can add that back later when our mind is more deliberate and it's not just this unconscious act. So Donna was looking at tasks from a very narrow, unconscious point of view. We could also look at tasks from a very deliberate, expanded point of view, such as you'll always have some tasks. Like, I doubt very seriously, even when you are retired, even when you have 7 days a week to yourself, you will have, if you put tasks only on a notebook, it would always have something on it. I need to go visit the grandkids, or I need to go pick up milk, or I need to prepare for the storms that are coming. Physical storms like, rain, or, wherever you move, snow, whatever. There's always going to be challenges. Therefore, we'll always have a list of things that need to get done. Could we agree that that's a little bit more of an expanded view? You've always been doing tasks. You're doing tasks now. You'll always be doing tasks. We can take this expanded view of things. I have had a job in the past. I've lost my job, but I'll have a job in the future. It doesn't matter. Like it's gonna happen. Would it make sense to sit there and narrowly focus on the point of not having a job? That's a concept, a point of not having a job. Well, no, but I can use a different concept, which is more expanded to kind of balance that out, huh? Does that make sense? That's kind of a way of looking at things. It's not just like points of attention like shadows and reflections. It's a point of attention, a way of looking at things. You could even talk it to yourself. That's usually how that kind of thing will arrive. It will arrive as words in your mind. You'll talk those things to yourself. So it's the moment that my mind starts to focus on the fact that I lost my job, and I'm just using that as an example. We could use anything, the dishes didn't get done or the dishes did get done. It doesn't matter. We could think of so many different things that we can either narrowly focus on or we can take this expanded view. There'll always be dishes to do. So let's just walk in there, do some points of attention, do some of this with our hands. That's really all we're doing. I mean, it's not the death. It's fine. It's just the dishes. But if we think about them and we look at them and we imagine how terrible it's going to be, I don't think this group is doing much of that. So you can already see the progress, right? This group used to do that. Everybody in this group very likely used to do something like that. I did. That's why I can speak about it so intimately. So there's a third aspect, though. And the third aspect you could call synergy. I like that word now. I'm on board. Synergy, hydrostasy, this feeling of when the two things are in balance, you can learn to do both. You can learn to have a little bit of attention on a small point with a little bit of attention on a big point. Here's an example. You can, okay, so we'll use Gene because he has his camera on. Okay, so Gene, can you put your attention in your body at any point in your body? Are you aware of your physicality? Okay, can you also expand into the room while doing both? Can you expand into the room while having attention on your body? Yes. So at least for the hypothetical stage of things, we could say that it's possible. Gene just did it. He just paid attention to his body while paying attention to the bubble of perception, as we're calling it. It's just expanding into your environment. He just did it. So it's not really a hypothesis anymore. We've just instantly moved into theory that this can be done because he just did it. Now we need to repeat the experiment. Donna needs to do it. I need to do it. Vicky does it. We all do it. And then we report back. And then before you know it, we can go from a theory to a principle. Just a straight up principle that we can simultaneously look at a fixed point. I'm looking at the little YouTube symbol that's on my computer. There's a little YouTube symbol down here. Now I'm focusing in on that sucker, but I'm simultaneously listening behind me. I can do both. And that creates a third thing eventually. There's a third type of feeling that comes from holding the two apparent opposites in the present moment with your attention. So if you're de-arming a bomb and all of your attention is narrow, you might get nervous, you might start sweating, but if you can focus a little bit on your breath with that narrow attention, you're looking up at that free throw, you're about to do the serve. I said do the serve. I don't know. I don't know. You just prove how much you don't know about a sport when you talk about it like that. When you go to do the serve thing, there's probably a way to focus in on the ball while simultaneously focusing in on your breath and your spatial awareness. When you're doing both long enough, you enter a flow state. Am I wrong? So we can take that same principle and apply it to our entire life experience. That if we can learn to maintain both a fine point of attention We'll call it that. That's my first time ever calling it that, but I like that. A fine, and that just means small. A fine point of attention with an expanded point of attention. When you can learn to hold both at the same time, you more quickly enter flow and a state of balance. Now, balance will be different for everybody, yada, 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 but it can be felt. That's the synergy. When the opposing opposites are balanced, all of a sudden it's like, I feel more rooted. I feel stronger. I feel a little bit more powerful. Pinpoint. Yes. Does that make sense?
Yes, and the more often you notice it, the quicker you notice when it's off.
Yes. And now, Donna, were you done? Or did you accidentally turn your mic off? Because that would be
What did you say?
oh, I didn't know if you were still talking because
No.
there was okay. But that would be a perfect segue into how can mindfulness lead to behavioral change? And how can we differentiate what kind of words should I use? Maybe like law of attraction words. How can I differentiate inspired desire from what I guess is uninspired desire? Right? We just made a binary. That's what we do. The right thing or the wrong thing. How do we differentiate? Donna just pointed it out. That's a segue into that conversation. We don't have to go into that conversation, but that's a segue into the behavioral change conversation. And
Yeah, I think that in the beginning of the practice, we're trying a lot. We're trying to achieve something. We're trying, and the points of attention and the different practices and the infinite ways that we have learned to break it down into stages and all of that become sometimes fuzzy, because it's like, what am I learning here? What am I trying? I just want to feel better. We get overwhelmed with the work of balance. But um, if we can just lighten up that and just do it for the sake of being deliberate, and trust that just for the sake of being deliberate is going to get us some relief. We start noticing relief and then stop analyzing if I'm getting it or not getting it, or if it's too much work or not enough work, or but as a result of the practice, you can feel when you're out of practice. You can feel when you're pulled out of practice. You can become so much less tolerant. That's what happened this morning. I was so not in practice from last night. I kind of coasted, and then I started to get anxious, and then I fell asleep just from exhaustion of thinking too much. And then I woke up with it all right there. It got ugly, ugly. Like, I don't know if it was psychological suffering, but it was as close to it. It's what I would like to define as the most psychological suffering that I want to tolerate. And I have control over that. And I have a choice in that. I can take up the responsibility of practicing because I desire it, because that feeling is so intolerable to me. And I know without being deliberate, it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse, and I have no intention of letting it. And then I get sick. I get physically sick. So when I'm mentally unstable, I get physically sick very quickly. And I used to think that that was a terrible thing, and I was far too sensitive. Now I see it as a gift, because I never want to get sick again to the extent that I allowed myself to get sick in the past. So the momentum of the practice shows me when the momentum of not practicing much more quickly. My bottom isn't so low anymore. So yes, I can feel the difference between more subtle things now, and I can feel them quicker. And if I ignore them, the price to pay is far too much for me to accept, and I won't do it.
yeah, makes sense to me. And then so, yes, Donna,
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
was just commenting on that. So when you are practicing, to notice the difference between what is a thought that I'm thinking that I have come up with to solve a problem, or what is an inspired option or path that has been revealed to me as a result of my practice. There's a difference between the two. One is an ego-based problem solving thought process that I used to rely on 100%. And the other is more elegant, inspired flow, inner guru conversation, and not a thinking. It's not a result of thinking. It's a result of not thinking or less thinking. I don't want to say not thinking because I don't know if I'm ever not thinking, but much less thinking, more arriving at an option that feels more in flow. And there's never a perfect one. They're just more elegant. One is more elegant than the other, and hopefully they'll get more and more elegant. Whatever. I try not to judge it, but it arrives. And instead of I've searched for it and dug it up and sweat over it and squeezed it into place, that's more thought based. And this difference between the two becomes more and more subtle, but easier to notice. And that's only as a virtue of the practice.
Yeah, it is. And that's definitely going to take us down a path of discussion regarding behavioral change. So, which is great. That's definitely, something I don't mind talking about just because I see my behaviors. There's nobody that is going to be more aware of my own behaviors. Like, Shayna is around me a lot. The people who are around me a lot, they may be aware of one or two that I'm not as aware of, and so they could point it out. They could be like, Ernest, did you know that you're always doing this and this? And I'd be like, oh, wow, thanks. But for the most part, I am very hyper aware of my own mind, my own actions, my own thoughts, the things that are occurring. I don't know if hyper aware is the right term, but I just don't have a different one yet. There's a lot of awareness there. There's a lot of attention on my own behavior, and I see it changing, and I see how it's changing. And so I can definitely give examples. I can definitely talk about those things. However, any conversation, if it's going to go that direction, it's important to make one of the most important notes that I could about that. And Donna sort of touched on it. I wrote it down while she was talking, just so I wouldn't forget, that she mentioned that, is the non-judgment. So this practice has three pillars. The second pillar is mindfulness. Mindfulness is a form of non-judgment. And I'm going to define judgment so that we're not, just using all of these words haphazardly, but opinions about this, that, or the other thing. If I am thinking an opinion about Jean's shirt, I'm judging it. And the opinion is going to be based on my preferences. It has nothing to do with Jean, right? It's a reflection of my mind. That's what opinion is. Uh, Saying it's a color blue, we might say that's the truth because most of our color cones are going to register it as that color. Most. Maybe somebody has a different thing going on and they see something different, but they would be in the minority compared to the rest of us. So and I think I might have mentioned this on Facebook today. But the thing that happens the most often in terms of judgment is judging ourselves. And so that's the thing that is occurring most of the time with behavioral change is we're judging ourselves. We're judging the rate of change. Is this happening fast enough? We're judging the direction of change. Do we want to go this way? Do we want to go that way? And so there's a lot of thought that goes into their own actions, their own thoughts. So it's not just observing thought, it's observing thought and then thinking thought about the thought that you just observed, which is now violating the mindfulness principle. We're not being mindful if all we're doing is thinking repetitive thought about the thought or thinking repetitive thought about the behavior. And the most repetitive thought, let's see, trying to achieve itself is a habit. That's a habit that we start to get into, is this act of trying to achieve something. And most of these habits are coming because there is a derivative from it. Intention and will is the principle to build personal power. You intend it, which usually involves the direction of your attention. It always does. And the will, or the power to cross that bridge and actually do it. That builds what I call more empowerment, more flow of energy, more personal power. Well, that's going to happen even if you force it. So even if you force yourself into that posture, let's say Gene all of a sudden decides that he wants to run a 4:40. He wants to break records. That's his goal right now in his life experience, is to start breaking racing records. That could become a goal, and he could actually force himself into that goal at great expense to everything else around him. But he could still do it. And he would still likely gain personal power, the feeling of efficacy, like I can do this. But I would digress. That's not the most efficient dynamic. Problem solving, yes. The thinking about the problem solving, or thinking about how to solve a problem, is still creating the plug that doesn't allow the aha idea to flow, or the right question to ask somebody to help the communication flow, which could lead you to the solution to the whatever it was that we were faced with, whatever you want to call it, a challenge, a thing, I don't know. So if we talk about mindfulness, we also talk, the way that I talk about it, the way that I talk about an empowered mind, it also includes non-judgment, because that's just another thought stream that's a part of a larger habit of judging my own actions, judging my own thoughts. So, okay. So I'll get into Donna's question. So I'll just say this last point, that before we talk too much about behavior, it's really important that this practice addresses judging your own behavior. So if you feel like you've been eating too much ice cream and you eat too much ice cream, there's going to be a feeling there that Donna was talking about. And if we just pay attention to that feeling, eventually our actions will be in alignment to the feeling without all the thoughts. That process may take some days, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? So it's behavioral change without interfering. We're not going to interfere. We're not going to use force. I mean, you can try. Maybe you think you need to. I'm not going to tell you what's best for you. But yes, Donna, question.
So when it gets complicated for me, or when I start making the practice complicated because it's too much in my mind, because of judgment about it, or opinion about it, or problem solving, or whatever any of the destroyers are, I try to make it in the simplest. I try to break it down to the simplest form. And my question is, this whole behavioral change thing and the subtleties of what is inspired thought as opposed to what's an inspired idea as opposed to what's a thought that we're thinking to problem solve, is the hot pan on the stove. You use the example all the time. And I think I want to know if I'm on the right track is the question. I think that it's all really a version of the same thing. If I touch the hot stove, it burns, and I don't like that feeling. So I'm going to remember not to do it again, and I'm going to do something else. Or the hot pan, I'm going to use a pot holder. Or as I get closer to the stove, I am going to be more mindful about how I perform around the stove area. And that becomes more subtle. My behaviors become more subtle. My awareness becomes more. I'm aware of how high the heat is, and if I can feel the heat as I'm approaching the stove. So it may seem like it's all more complicated, but the basic premise is don't touch the hot pan, because it doesn't feel good, and it hurts, and it causes damage to me, and I would like to not do that. And that's what I meant by that whole example this morning, is when I'm not practicing, it doesn't feel good, and it results in behavioral change, because anything that doesn't feel good, I can apply the same principles as not touching the hot pan on the stove, and my awareness about the heat on the stove, and my awareness of other things, and the synergy of being able to cook with many pans on the stove, and also serve what comes out of the pans on the stove, and still be aware of the principles at play amongst many others, and being in my body and not judging. I'm an idiot, I touched the stove again, how many times do I have to touch the stove without burning my fingers? Or look how great I am, I can do all this at one time without, hey, I just made you dinner and I didn't burn my hand. It's, to me, it's all the same thing. And if I can just redirect myself to it, the basic principles, it becomes less of an overwhelming practice or an overwhelming goal to achieve. It's just right now, where is my mind, and did I put it there? And that's it. And that's the same thing that applies to the pan and the stove. Am I on track?
You are. And I would say that when you use the pan on the stove, we could differentiate that from something more subtle. It seems like it's the things that are more subtle that our mind wants to give more thought to, such as, should I do this or should I do that? That might seem a little bit more subtle than pain and physical danger. That's louder. That's jumping off of a roof is going to be much louder of a decision as, should I go to the party over here? Should I go to the party over there? There's both a party. It just seems more
Sure,
subtle.
I just mean, as a result of the practice, the
Mhm.
thinking becomes intolerant. Like, I notice it a lot sooner. Should I go to the
Yes.
party or shouldn't I? Or what am I going to wear? I don't have anything to wear, so I'm not going to that party. Or I'm too fat for all my clothes, and I don't want to. I don't want anybody to see me like this. All those are legitimate thoughts that I've thought over many times. But the intolerance of that, as a result of practicing, the intolerance of those thoughts I become as sensitive to it as touching the hot pan on the stove. The hot pan on the stove was an easy one in the beginning, and the others were much more subtle. But the virtue of the practice is that those subtleties become much more easily observable, because
Yes.
the same principles apply.
Yes. Yeah. That's the right track. So same principles apply. It's all coming from the same core, deliberate attention. Has my mind arrived on purpose, even if it's gently? Even if it's more of an abstract type of peripheral, gentle attention on the moment, just touching it very lightly, or you're really focusing in, or you're doing a balance of both, doesn't matter. It's all these pillars. And Donna's pointing out that it is all still just that third pillar that's occurring. And it can be very subtle things. We start to judge ourselves. That's usually very subtle at first. But the more that you get used to the cognitive attention training, which is paying attention to your thoughts, and the more that you're creating the space necessary in those thoughts to really feel how you feel, that's when it becomes reliable. It becomes, how you feel becomes reliable when you're able to, by using the practice, and that's paying attention more to think less. Because as Donna has famously said, you can't not do something. So I don't not think. I pay attention to the present moment so much that thinking, especially repetitive habitual thinking, is interrupted. Doesn't always interrupt my mind wanting to interpret inspiration or something that feels very, profound for me for some reason. I'm having an aha moment, and that's what I call the voice of power. My mind wants to, it's in the habit of communicating that to me, and I'm just going to allow that for now. I don't need to declare war on that dynamic. But yeah, I think Donna's right on point. So the more that we practice this practice, the more we create space. The more that we create space, the more that we can feel things that are occurring, and that feeling is more reliable than when you are lost in unconsciousness. Because when you're that water hose of attention, everywhere you point your attention, there's an emotional derivative, there's a vibrational derivative, there's an effect or from that cause. The cause of looking this direction, focusing on this thing, has a determinable effect. There's always an effect, and it'll affect how you feel. It'll affect your mood. It'll affect everything. So the more that we're used to paying attention to the practice, the more that, like Donna pointed out, we can tell when we're in the practice and when we're not. It becomes really distinguishable. I am either paying attention to the moment or I am not. But then it can get into more subtle aspects of the practice. Am I judging myself? Am I, going through these same patterns that don't feel good? Am I doing the same thing expecting a different result, or am I interjecting some little bit of difference just to see if we can get a different derivative over here? But yeah, Donna, I think that's in terms of behavioral change, because folks say you got to go with how you feel, and you mentioned it, and I can go into great detail about it. All right, see you, Ida. Have a good rest of your day. But would be the destroyers. You mentioned the destroyers, and that taints how you feel. So sometimes how you feel is wildly unreliable because it's being based off of these habits. So if how you feel is based on your repetitive thought, how you feel isn't because of Gene. It's not because of Lisa. It's because of how I'm thinking. But I'm very likely going to blame Gene and Lisa and everybody else because that's a part of the habit when you get lost in those habits.
Yes, but the moment, yes, and not but, yes, and the momentum of the practice makes you notice, I don't feel good. While I'm blaming Gene for saying something that made me not feel good, I go, wait a minute, I don't feel good. It's just like hot pan. I redirect or back to the practice, because the only thing I can control about that situation is me. And then once I go back to my practice, then perhaps I see that situation differently. Perhaps I don't, but it removes the judgment from it, because it's really all about how I am going to proceed. I can accept the situation, I can redirect, I can get back in my body, whichever way gets me to feeling good again and in balance, that synergy happening. And then once that's happening, then I move more elegantly with my words, with my actions, with my behavioral choices.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that rather than just this, undefined feeling, where you just follow the feeling or feel what's good, because that can be very undefined. If you're in the habit of smoking crack, crack can feel good to a certain extent until it doesn't, but I really appreciate that you differentiated and you went back to that feeling of balance, that feeling of the synergy where the two things have created a third thing, because I think that's really important. You can feel that along with a lot of different things. But I think, Donna, you are giving it back to me, like you're telling it back to me, that how the practice influences behavioral change, how this practice of non-interference, non-judgment, not trying to control, eventually will still help your behavior be more in alignment to at least a functional species, a functional living thing that isn't a detriment to itself and other people. I think that's a fair, uh, basic definition that we could use as just a function. We can see so many examples of dysfunction, folks. Like, we don't need to go into all of them, but we could see these micro examples of a functional mind that when, let's say, something occurs, you have stimuli and then you have response. Now, the response could be from old habits, but because, as Donna has pointed out, she's practicing and her practice has gained momentum, she sees that response right away, right? But because she's also, so used to practicing, she doesn't judge that response, which is usually what will happen commonly. That'll be one of the very first things that a person does, is they put it in the category of right or wrong, should have or shouldn't have. So I'm being very general, and I think the generality could be beneficial because we can all put whatever we want in its place. So stimuli, response. Response didn't feel that great. We Because we're practicing, or maybe we talk about it a week later, we can identify that this response is from an older habit. a habit that's still with us. I can't say it's older, it's still with us, but it's older because it's been with us for a while. It's gained a lot of momentum. Are you with me so far in this example? Stimuli, response. So I think Donna and I right now are just making sure that we're on the same page with how this all affects behavioral change. So we have stimuli and we have response. The common response to your response is to respond with thinking about your response and judging your response. I shouldn't have done that. I should have done that. There's a better way. There's a worse way. Now there may be some ways to talk about it that way, but there's no real need to do it to yourself in the moment, when you're navigating a situation. Maybe later, Gene and I will talk about it in these very binary terms and we'll say there was a better way to cross the street. You could have looked both ways first. We would agree that's better because but he still could get hit. Now, that could still happen. He could look both ways and then the car runs the stop sign and he still gets hit. Space junk could fall from the sky and that's no fault of his own, but I would still agree that looking both ways is better than haphazardly running into the street like an idiot. So noticing how it feels. I try to keep it to noticing how it feels, flow versus static, smooth versus bumpy. And that is only going to be super accessible as a result of the practice, as a result of the momentum of the practice. And like Donna said, finding it earlier, in the response and not judging the response. That would be our practice. So we have stimuli, we have response, and then our mind starts to go into the habit of judging ourselves. And then, wait, I'm going to use my rule of 3. I'm going to redirect. I'm going to go back to my practice, go back to my points of attention. The way that I just responded isn't necessarily how I want to respond. I don't think that it's in flow, and that's fine. So you see how it's not passively accepting a behavior that you don't necessarily want. It's not necessarily in flow with everything else, but you're also not judging it. You're not trying to change it. Awareness itself will allow the change to occur because the lag will become lesser and lesser and lesser and lesser to the point where now you're just responding to how you feel. I don't like feeling anxious, so I'm not going to think about this before it happens. I don't like the feeling of covering up lies, so I'm going to do my best not to dish them out. Cause and effect. Where is the feeling in all of that? The more that you're paying attention to the present moment, the more that you feel that synergy, the more you can feel when you're not in synergy, the more that you're doing the practice of redirecting even behavior. And I think that we have well established to this point that it's so important that the judgment can't be there for this to occur. The judgment will occur as a form of thought, and it must be redirected in this practice before even touching behavioral change. Because frankly, the behavioral change is happening on its own. It's happening anyway. We can look at our behaviors. Maybe Gene, when he would get cut off in traffic 2 or 3 years ago, would just get really heated. Maybe now he doesn't. That wasn't necessarily a focus of his practice. He didn't join the meeting today because he wanted to overcome, getting angry in traffic, but it was still a derivative. That's also the key, is that you don't even have to try to change your behavior. You'll look over at the towel on the bed. You'll see that it is now transferring its wetness to the bed. You'll remember what it's like to lay down into that wetness when you go to lay down, and that's not comfortable. And because you were aware, you were present, you saw it, you picked the towel up and you put it in the hamper instead. Small behavioral change will lead to big behavioral change, and before you know it, you're not lying as much. You're not doing things as much that don't benefit you. And you can even start to see these subtle attempts to manipulate. How else, Donna, can we start to get past the violence in the mind if we don't see the violence as violence, these little things as violence? There's big things as violence too, but we're definitely not going to talk about Will Smith and Chris Rock.
Yeah, the towel on the bed, and what was the other example you just gave? I don't know. Lying. Those things you can weigh and judge as being, I want to be a better person, or I want to be a better spouse, or I want to be, but the cutting off in traffic, you could justify your rightness of your evaluation of that guy doing something dangerous. Now, whether they're an asshole or they were being mindless or they weren't being a good driver at that moment for whatever reason, and that could make you angry, and you could be very justified in your opinion about that. But the violence is what you're doing to yourself. The violence is hearing your own voice when you go, look at this guy, what an idiot, whatever feeling you have when that happens. The violence is to you. That guy can't hear you in the car, but it feels bad. You feel angry. Angry doesn't feel good unless, you were hopeless before you felt angry. And angry at least is a more powerful emotion than hopelessness. But if it's unless anger is a relief to something that's worse than anger, it doesn't feel good in your body, and you notice it and you go, what am I doing? Like, this is a beautiful day and there's so many things that I could be focused on besides being angry. You don't even have to have that thought process. You can feel that it just doesn't feel good. Based on that feeling, I'm going to redirect. And yeah, it's the judgment that's the hard part to get rid of.
It is, even feeling justified in your judgment. Even if, let's just say that there is justification, the thought of it is still unbeneficial and unnecessary, ultimately unnecessary. There is a way that we could work with it to make it beneficial in a voice of power type of context, and that's working with the practice. But eventually, that's also not necessary. Like, I just don't need to think the thought about the other person at all. And eventually it just, like you said, it just, even the thought itself about the person won't feel in alignment. It won't feel like that synergistic balance. I'm starting to go to one extreme or the other, and that's pulling me away from that synergy. And eventually, the further that the two get away from the center, that synergistic bubble pops, and I'm no longer in that synergy. Now I'm angry. Now I'm, raging against traffic, or I'm judging their, they are a shitty driver, and that's the truth. But that's okay. I'm just going to let them be shitty drivers. And then there's still like that judgment that eventually, it's like, are they a shitty? Maybe they're a new driver. Maybe they're a student driver. Maybe they're old and don't see very well, or, maybe they were responding to somebody else who wasn't driving well, and it just had a trickle down effect of, it looked like nobody knew what they were doing. Who knows, right? Eventually, it's just no judgment really benefits me, because it's most judgment is speculative and it's opinion oriented. And most of that is just never necessary for me. I mean, I don't need to do that. And when I say for me, I just mean that it's just not necessary.
Your mic's off. Nope.
How about now?
There you are.
Okay. But yeah, so ultimately you'll be able to start to feel that synergy and that balance, and on a more broader scale, like you start to feel just what doesn't have any real benefit. And Jerry's in the room, and one that Jerry and I like to talk about is focus on self, is just the sheer volume of thought that is about yourself. That's an indication of what's occurring, and that is not necessary. Another aspect of unnecessary thought is thinking about yourself. Who are you telling again about yourself? Oh, you're telling yourself. How can you tell yourself something that you don't already know? That's impossible. Even if you're talking it out, I get it. I've done that before. I like to still do that sometimes. I'll talk it out to organize the thoughts. But if you're doing that unconsciously, you're literally just trying to communicate with yourself, which is literally insane. I can't tell myself something that I don't already know, because it's coming from me to me. Like, so eventually we can start to differentiate things that just no longer serve me, but then just no longer serve really any functional purpose. And all of those things can start to kind of fizzle away. And then the behavioral change, it becomes self-evident. So you start to see, using one of Jerry and I's favorite thing is that focus on the self. When you realize, that's kind of philosophical, but you realize that it's not beneficial to you, you start to use your practice and you redirect it when it occurs. You realize how much you're actually just thinking about your damn self all the time. And eventually that doesn't feel good. I don't want to sit here and think about myself all the time. What good does that do? What kind of ripples am I putting into the pond of the universe just thinking about me? Like me thinking about me. Like that just, I get it. It can still happen sometimes, but to just do that unconsciously eventually doesn't feel good. The focus on self just doesn't feel balanced. It doesn't feel good. Like I said, it can still exist, but it doesn't have to be something that I focus on and then it gets me out of balance. Does that make sense? And I mean, the sheer amount of behavioral change that will come from not focusing on yourself is phenomenal. A lot of the anger and the aggression that's in the human species, it just really comes to the surface when you're no longer just constantly focusing narrowly on yourself. Remember, I was talking about the way that people would congratulate me or say I did a good job, you crushed it, you killed it. There's all of this violence in our species that just doesn't need to be there. And those are behavioral changes. I don't really want to talk like that. I don't want to tell Jerry that she did a good job by saying she murdered it. Like it's 2022. I can go beyond that type of language and say something a little bit more constructive. You know, what a fantastic display of skill you just showed. But yeah, all the weird competition and everything, it's just, yeah. You start to feel all of that. And this is just playing into more about the point of behavioral change. You just be surprised how much, and maybe you haven't. Maybe that's something that you guys could discuss as well. We're running out of time, but what are some of the behavioral changes that you've noticed in yourself? The things that you didn't necessarily plan for, but you just notice the more that you're mindful, the more that you're present, you just can't help but notice your response to things is changing. I would venture to guess that that will be a rest of our life type of thing as well. That there's no image of perfection, that there's always going to be wrinkles that are kind of unraveling themselves. Maybe not for everybody, I don't know. But I think a lot of us, we start really focusing on this stuff at a certain point in our life. We've accumulated a lot of unconsciousness, far more, I think, than we realize at first. All right, any questions, comments? Anything you guys would like to touch on before we head out? So I did point that out as a technique that we can do, right? You can use like that more peripheral, expanded. Try that. That's one of the foundations of my practice. So yeah, Gene, go ahead.
Yeah, when you mentioned it to me, I expanded my bubble of perception, and I was aware of my feet on the floor and aware of the second point of attention. And I noticed about a minute later, I forgot what that second point of attention was. And in addition, while I was listening to what everyone was talking about, I lost my first point of attention. And it took about 2 minutes. That's just a comment. And so I tend to then evaluate it. I say to myself, maybe there's a function of the brain that some people have and other people don't. and mine might be keeping a point of attention for more than a minute. Or is it just 78 years of experience of sending my brain all over the place?
Maybe it's both. Maybe it's either or. You will figure it out one way or the other, but the thought process won't figure it out one way or the other, would it? Like you could sit there and think about that thought, that because it's a speculative thought, is it this or is it that? But then, I know, Gene, we would find some way to experiment on this and find out conclusively that it didn't matter in the first place.
was the most difficult thing for me in the beginning is to be in my body, because I was in my head all the time. So that's why I just picked breath and feet. I just did breath and feet for a year. Like, I mean, I would try and on all the different things that you were suggesting, and I would do them. It was more like a formal practice. I wouldn't remember them during the course of the day while I was working or while I was walking. I was distracted by everything, but remembering my feet, just remembering, I could feel myself being up in my head, and the tension, the feeling associated with that wasn't fun. And so I would just go by, where's body in my body? Where's my body? So breath was a quick one to get me right into my body, and feet on the floor. And I was in and out of it, mostly out of it in the beginning, and just remembering, I would just say, body, where my body? Where am my body? Just like I'm where, because I wasn't in my body at all. Listening to somebody else talk took me out of my body. Everything that was distractible took me out of my body. It was clearly what I needed to remember. And it was a long time. So Jean, I don't think that is, I have my opinions about the way your brain works, but that's a whole nother story. But I don't think that that's unusual, that you forget while you're listening. And that, I mean, it certainly was my experience. Maybe it's genetic, but I wasn't remembering all of the time in the beginning at all. And it took me a long time to even congratulate myself for remembering, instead of going, holy crap, I forgot again. I just forgot. It was only 2 minutes. It was, it took me a long time to stop doing that.
Me too. Yeah. Because I was coming from like martial arts groups, and where everybody's comparing everything and timing everything, and everything needs to be perfect and here and there. Yeah. So when I say let that go, but that's a weird way of putting it. I didn't let it go. I just started doing other things with my mind instead. But when I started doing other things with my mind while doing Tai Chi, I started to enjoy it. I started to feel it, and all of a sudden it's like, I'm not doing this so I can sit here and think about it the whole time while I'm doing it. That makes no sense at all. So the practice helped me to be able to move my body without thinking about it. And that
Like
equals a
what you
type
said
of flow.
earlier was something formal. A formal practice really does
Yep.
help. So that's why I started with 18 gates as soon as class started, because listening at class and doing my 18 gates got me at least a narrower focus than the stream of tasks that just started flowing in my mind and distracting me from everything but my body. Listening was one, and doing the 18 gates was getting me in my body. So at least I was narrowing everything down, slowing that whole thing down. So your formal practice of, I mean, even when you were doing Tai Chi in the beginning, or karate or whatever it was, you were saying that you were thinking the whole time you were doing that, even though you were in a room with no other distractions, not work, not your wife, not driving, not anything, but you were still in your mind. Just that formal practice eventually helped you to not let go, to do other things with your mind other than constantly thinking. That more flow started to happen. So, and that has to do with engaging your body. You were actually engaging your body, getting out of your head. So the formal practice was definitely helped me pick up my practice again more easily. Let me do something formal. Let me stop for a minute and get in my body, and then the rest of it I'll remember until I forget again.
Jerry says the art of tending to my garden is my business. Everything and other else isn't my business. That's a fair statement. Yeah. Fair statement. I would say though, it feels to me that there is a before and an after in my life. And it was that thought in the car when we were coming back from it was no, that's not Turkey Run is in Indiana, Starved Rock. And I had the aha. I wasn't doing anything with my mind. If I'm not doing anything with it deliberately, it's still going to do something. And there was just that moment where I just had clear as day. It was just so, and that's the third pillar. Where is my mind and did I put it there? But That's why I didn't enjoy myself as much as I knew I could have when I was out in that forest area. And that, I think a little bit of that example is what you were mentioning, Donna. I didn't have any impending doom. There was nothing going wrong in the universe right at that moment. But yet I didn't make that connection. I wasn't happy as or at least as feeling as good as I knew I could. And then it just hit me. It was like a ton of bricks. You weren't doing anything with your mind. You were not placing it anywhere on purpose. What did you expect? And then it was kind of a done deal from then on. So I don't like awakening dates and all that kind of stuff, because what did I realize? I realized I had to do something. So the realization was cool, but the doing the something is where the practice is and where the power exists. But I still appreciate that realization, the aha moment where it was like, and it is forever. That's not the dynamic. I don't bring a dynamic to the table where you level up, where you become some sort of image of perfection or anything like that. That I don't, yeah, just not into any of that. All right, any questions, comments, or concerns? Great discussion. That's starting to get into behavioral change. Behavioral change, I'll start. Yeah, I have to talk about the destroyers, because it's the nemesis, unconsciousness. Unconsciousness is feeding and being fed by these destroyers, and it will be noticeable to a certain extent when you start to break free of the destroyers. Break free. Maybe there's another way to put that that's less violent. Not breaking free. I'm dissolving, in a manner of speaking. I'm not giving it the energy it needs to exist. But you notice that everybody else still is. So, and again, to go into a thought about it would lead to something that's disadvantageous to me. But you could, they release you more so than you release them. It's kind of like they release their grip on you to where you're not being. So here's an example, and then I'll leave it here because we're at an hour and a half. But entertainment is one of the destroyers I don't talk as much about, because the mind likes entertainment. That's where that habit comes from, the derivative of us feeling something that we enjoy. That's why when we're in a state of unconsciousness, how you feel isn't always reliable, because stealing could feel good to you if you're used to it and you get something that you want from it. Now all of a sudden you do it for the thrill and for the derivative, the result. Now you're still doing something that's unbeneficial to you and people around you because it feels good, because that person in that example is in a firm grip of one, if not all, of the destroyers, the societal destroyer and that entertainment destroyer, to where the mind is perpetually at odds with the present moment and requires even more dramatic stimuli to hold its attention, to capture its attention, to want to place your attention there. So if you look at film has gotten more and more and more and more dramatic compared to the way that it used to be. Writing, maybe not, because we've been doing writing for so long. Like, you can go back to some historical writers that were like, whoa, that's some weird shit, bodies in the walls and stuff like that, really interesting things. But I don't know where I was going with that. I got into thinking about strange books that I've read. I know I was talking about the destroyers. Yeah. But what would it, just imagine. So we'll do our hypothesis real quick and then we'll go, Gene. Have you ever had a moment where you weren't necessarily doing a bunch of stuff, but you weren't necessarily bored either? Has that state, that so we can admit that state exists, to where you don't necessarily have to be doing a bunch of stuff, but you can still be happy. You can still be at ease with the moment. So we know that that's possible. So it goes from hypothesis to theory. Now, how do we do it? Like, what's the experiment that we build around so that we can all replicate this, so that we can all do it and we can all, report back, and then that's the scientific method, and it becomes an evidence-based thing that we're doing here. But could you imagine not always needing stimuli to feel content, happy with the moment? What's that like? You don't need, and now I'm not judging. I'm not saying that looking at your cell phone is wrong. I'm not saying that watching TV is wrong. I'm not saying that playing a video game is wrong or going dancing is wrong. Like, goodness, I'm always talking about balance. I'm never saying that most things are not just going to be categorically in the wrong department, you know? But if there's no balance there, then it becomes even severe psychological and physical suffering for ourselves and others. That's what the destroyers do. And then it gets to the point where we require it. That's when it's a destroyer, because we've gotten so far into an extreme of entertainment that we require jumping out of airplanes. We're not doing it just because we just want to see what it's like. Gene said it was fun, and I'm like, all right, well, I'm already having a lot of fun, Gene, but I might as well jump out of an airplane. You know a lot about it, and I trust Gene, so I'm gonna go ahead and do it. That sounds a little bit more balanced than I have to jump out of airplanes and the like to enjoy myself, to have fun. I have to feel that rush. I have to feel that stimuli. That's creating that stepping pattern that we talked about. And then before you know it, that's in everything. That's in relationships. I have to feel that spark of new in order to be comfortable, because my mind requires that constant hum of entertainment and newness through external artificial, I use artificial in air quotes, situational circumstances. And then, yeah, so the destroyers can get very, very intrusive. Their grip gets very, very strong. So there's a mind that sits in the middle. I could go to Six Flags. If Gene was like, Ernest, you want to go to Six Flags? We'll go to a theme park and we'll have some fun. It's going to be a nice day. The opportunity presented itself. I have nothing else to do today. I'm just going to go ahead and go to Six Flags and we're going to have fun. Or maybe I don't. Maybe I don't go to Six Flags because I'd rather just sit here. And then that can get a little bit, I go to bed really early because I'm just living my best life. But that puts me at odds with a lot of my friends because they start their nights at 8 p.m. Do I make a problem out of that? No, I just wait till spring and summer when they're starting to do outdoor activities. I'm the perfect person to invite to an afternoon barbecue or a morning barbecue. Brunch, okay. But do you want to go late night clubbing? You're on your own. And it's not because late night clubbing is good or bad or positive or negative. Ernest likes to go to bed early. I feel good. I like that. That's my synergy. It's balanced. And it's just my balance. But you see, that can still put me at odds with like social groups. And then so these other destroyers start to show themselves, where now people are like, Ernest, you just don't go out. You don't do anything. You're boring. I could hear that all the time because I don't need anything. I do it all the time. Shayna sees me sitting over here in the corner. I'm not doing a fucking thing. But I'm okay. Does that make sense? So freedom is in going to Six Flags or not going to Six Flags and still feeling free no matter what. Free to choose, free to go left, free to go right, free to, I don't care, doesn't matter. Or yes, sure, I'll go. And like Donna was talking about earlier, when we're not in flow, where we're not interrupting flow, excuse me. So when we're not interrupting flow and things are flowing more smoothly, we'll either go or we won't go, but we don't need all that lag of thinking about it and comparing and contrasting and judging. And then before you know it, there is stimuli, adaptation, learning. The stimuli was Gene inviting me to Six Flags. I went to Six Flags and had a fucking terrible time. I'm going to use that in the future. The next time that Michael invites me to Six Flags, I'll be like, you know what? I still feel like going. I'll give it another try. Maybe Gene was the problem, not Six Flags. And then so I go with Mike and I still have a bad time. I'm like, okay, wait a second. This really feels like Six Flags has just got some janky rides that just aren't that fun. There's so many possibilities. That's just one. Nothing against Six Flags there. But yeah, this was an excellent discussion in behavioral change. It kind of led into that. It started out as something a little bit different. If you go back and watch the replay, we have an excellent trick of attention in terms of maintaining the bubble of perception. This expanded view, Gene is able to pay attention to his body while expanding his bubble of perception at the same time. So if hypothetically we can take it to theory, then in theory we can learn to do it more often and maybe even learn to do it almost all the time, to one extent or to one degree or another. And then on Tuesday, we talked about all the happiness and all the joy and all the things that come from this practice. Today, we talked about the natural behavioral change that can come from this practice, because we start to feel the synergy of balance. And when we start to go in and out, we know it. And before you know it, Jerry, I use you, I don't really use you an example. I just use you as a focus point of the discussion because, we talk about that inner guru and how inner guru is like, no, 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 you're doing it again. You're just chasing a spark. You're just doing the same thing again based on this pattern and this habit. And this is your response. You don't have to judge it good or bad, but you do have a choice right now. And that choice is either going to feel like cherry picking and ignoring what I know, or it's going to feel like just redirecting my mind a different direction in a very profound way, multiple points of attention, just so I can get going in a different vector than the one I was just going in. And that all that is going from unconscious habit to I'm just going to go this direction because I can. And that's better than going in this direction because it was an unconscious habit. All that makes sense? But yes, Donna, I think that you and others and, with this practice, behavioral change is becoming a topic. There was a time where I wouldn't have felt as comfortable talking about behavioral change because there's that kicker, not judging yourself. And I don't mean not judging yourself. I mean, when you start to judge yourself, you redirect those thought patterns using the rule of three and maintaining that rule of three as long as necessary to get going in a different direction, as often as necessary so that we're not being passive to unproductive directions of the mind and behavior. Cool. And we'll gather more evidence.
That's been a part of the practice day one.
What part? Jerry?
Downing yourself. Got to stop. That's just a.
Oh, you're right. It's a form of leaking power.
Yeah.
And I think though we still acknowledge how much momentum judging ourselves and others has. And so let's say you do judge another person. Let's say, let's say Lisa is late to a meeting. And let's say you have a judgmental thought. Lisa's late because she's lazy. That's not true, Lisa. Like, we know you are anything but lazy. That's why you're so good as an example for that one, because you're so diametrically not that. They know that I'm just using you as an example. But let's say, Jerry, that occurred. You can still use your practice to not judge yourself for thinking the judgmental thought. That just happened. Maybe I'm going to silently apologize to Lisa energetically for giving her that unfair judgmental thought. And then I'm going to redirect my mind. I'm going to pay attention to my bubble of perception. I'm going to expand it while simultaneously condensing it into the Dantian. I'm going to do both of those at the same time while telling myself we're all going to be late sometimes. It's going to happen. I'm going to be late. And this is that broader perspective. You see what I'm doing? Or you could say that's not any of my business. That's a good one too. It's unless you're the leader of the meeting, then it could be your business. So if it's a board meeting and Lisa is your subordinate and you're the boss and she's constantly late, it may be your business. But outside of that particular scenario that we have both agreed upon, then no, it's probably not. If she's a coworker, then no, it's very likely not any of your business. And what if Mike is like, well, she always gets away with being late. How come she gets away with it and I don't? Oh boy. Now we're comparing, now we're contrasting, now we're labeling and judging, and now it's going to lead to a rabbit hole, and that rabbit hole will lead to unproductivity in our team. But maybe Jerry's the group of that, or the leader of that group, the organizer of that group, and that may be her responsibility later to talk to Lisa about being on time, or maybe she can't be a part of this group or this meeting. This I went to like a business scenario. Yeah. All right. Well, I will see you guys again on Tuesday. The book should be ready very soon. It is still going through Grammarly, but that process is it's just a process. I just got to get through it, and then it'll be ready. But putting the book through Grammarly, I think, is going to help tremendously in its readability, and that's important. You got to be able to read it to like it. So I hope you like it. But otherwise, yeah, I am unemployed, so I've been spending my time doing some things here and there. So you may see a couple, maybe a course or something like that emerge, some magazines and things like that emerge, just because I have time and I like doing that stuff. So I'm probably going to create some stuff in this time that I have, because why not? All right. Well, I will see you guys again on Tuesday. If I don't see you before that, if you have any questions or anything that you'd like to talk about in the group study, just let me know. Otherwise, I will have this recording up pretty soon so that you can rewatch it if you'd like. All right. See ya. Have a good day, everyone.